has not really started, and I'm going to be rushing through this media briefing because there will be a plenary session that will begin in Taj Palace in exactly 5 minutes from now. So let me first tell you the significance of this event, and you're aware that we are really celebrating 25 years of India-ASEAN relations, and in that context, our Prime Minister had invited all the 10 leaders of ASEAN to come for a commemorative summit. This is the second one in 5 years. The last one was held in 2012 to commemorate 20 years of India-ASEAN friendship. This one is significant because 25th year obviously has a huge significance. But what makes it absolutely historic is the fact that we would have all the 10 leaders as chief guests for our Republic Day. That is unprecedented. It has never happened before. And there are elements of the Republic Day in their participation, which I can tell you as part of the program. So let me quickly tell you, after their arrival, you know that Prime Minister returned from Davos yesterday early morning, and soon thereafter the leaders started arriving. And he went straight into receiving them bilaterally as well, and I'll go into that separately. So already our Prime Minister has had 6 bilateral meetings with the 10 ASEAN, out of the 10 ASEAN leaders. This morning, the formal program began with a luncheon banquet hosted by Rashtrapati Ji, and that was followed by a retreat session hosted by Prime Minister. And now, in 5 minutes from now, they will move into a plenary session of the summit. You will be able to, I think, see it on television as well, because there is one portion of the summit plenary proceedings, which is really our Prime Minister's opening remarks, and the chair of ASEAN, which happens to be Singapore this year, his opening remarks would be available in the presence of media, so it will be telecast. Thereafter, there will be a closed session. The theme of the summit is shared values, common destiny, and it is under that rubric that we would be discussing the entire gamut of our relations, of India-ASEAN relations that are conducted under 3 pillars of political security, of economic, and of socio-cultural cooperation. So we will be covering, the leaders would be talking on these issues at the plenary. Thereafter, our Prime Minister has organized a banquet in honor of the visiting dignitaries, which will also take place at Taj Hotel. The plenary will begin with the traditional photo opportunity of, as we call it, the family photo of the leaders together, and followed by a release of stamps, of 11 stamps, with a common theme of Ramayana, which links our countries of our region together. And then they move into the discussions. Ramayana, as you know, has been an important theme, and there are troops from all the 10 ASEAN countries currently touring India, performing Ramayana in Delhi at Kamani Auditorium, and thereafter they'll travel to other cities. The bilaterals that they've had so far, that Prime Minister has had so far, have been with Myanmar, with Vietnam, with Philippines, Thailand, Singapore, and with the Sultan of Brunei. Now, I'll separately go through what are the important elements of the bilaterals with each of the leaders, but the most important element about the bilateral, I can't tell you much about the substantive content of the plenary session because it's yet to begin, except the broad framework under which the discussions will take place. But the fact that, you know, all the 10 leaders are in town, it does provide us an opportunity, our Prime Minister, to individually meet with all the leaders on the margins of the ASEAN summit. There was one aspect which was common to most of the meetings that our Prime Minister held since yesterday with the 6 leaders of the ASEAN countries. Since Prime Minister had returned from Davos, there was one thing that they repeatedly mentioned, was they conveyed their deep appreciation for Prime Minister's speech at Davos. It has been extremely well received by the leadership of ASEAN, in ASEAN countries, because it has a very special resonance with each one of them, given the subject that our Prime Minister spoke on. And in fact, our Prime Minister acknowledged that what he conveyed or expressed were really views that he had picked up in his interactions with these very leaders, because, as you know, he's been meeting them annually, and he was really articulating the collective views of our countries together. specifically on other issues which are common, of course. The most important element that our Prime Minister focused upon was he conveyed his deepest appreciation to the 6 leaders that he has met with bilaterally, and also in the retreat when he made his opening remarks. The fact that their presence here means so much to us. The fact that he invited all the 10 leaders shows how ASEAN is at the fulcrum of India's Act East policy. But their acceptance of his invitation and their complete presence of all 10 of them is historic, as I mentioned, and therefore he used the opportunity of his bilateral meetings to convey his deepest appreciation and thanks to the leaders for their presence here. It underscored the importance we attach, of course, to ASEAN relations and to the solidarity and centrality of ASEAN and its position in the regional security architecture. Of course, the leaders thanked PM for the warm hospitality, and they looked forward to being chief guests tomorrow. As you know, the Republic Day Parade they will be there, and they'll also then participate at the at-home to be hosted by Rashtrapati Ji. All the leaders that PM met stated that India's multifaceted cooperation with ASEAN is important for peace, security, stability, and prosperity in the Indo-Pacific region. Specifically, as far as Myanmar is concerned, there were, of course, all issues of bilateral and regional interests that were discussed with the State Councillor. Prime Minister and the State Councillor talked about further strengthening of bilateral relations, of operationalization of the Sitwe port, the trilateral highway, and other cross-border trade. Of course, peace and security along the border was yet another very important issue that was discussed, and about India's proposal of the project to construct housing in the Rakhine state for the development of the Rakhine state. As far as the Prime Minister of Vietnam is concerned, when Prime Minister had visited Vietnam in September 2016, our strategic partnership was upgraded to a comprehensive strategic partnership. And under that rubric, defense and maritime cooperation in the Indo-Pacific region was discussed. Our 2 Prime Ministers also talked about the operationalization of the $100 million line of credit, which involves manufacturing of offshore patrol vessels, which has been contracted to Larsen & Toubro. Another topic that was discussed was the need for tapping the full potential of bilateral trade and investment so that we can reach the trade target of $15 billion by 2020. There was great appreciation of the high level of political exchanges that are taking place, continue to take place between our 2 countries. And in that context, it was decided to hold the Joint Commission meeting, which is convened by the 2 foreign ministers, External Affairs Minister from our side, which will be held later this year. To expedite, you would remember when Prime Minister had gone to Vietnam, he had also made an offer of a $500 million line of credit, for which the Vietnamese Prime Minister informed our Prime Minister that they're in the process of identifying projects that could be undertaken under this particular offer. He also said that soon Vietnam would be announcing direct flights between Vietnam and India, and spoke about enhancing greater cooperation in offshore oil and gas sector. 2 MOUs were signed at the end of the discussions. One was of increasing cooperation in information and communications, and the other was an implementation agreement on an ASEAN-India Center of Satellite Tracking and Telemetry Station. So there is one ASEAN-India Center tracking station already in Biak in Indonesia, and this one will further enhance our cooperation with ASEAN in that context, and it will be hosted by Vietnam. The next meeting, which was held late last night, was with the President of Philippines, and in spite of the fact that by their local time, it was almost perhaps midnight, but the meeting was very cordial, and they did discuss, they picked up on the threads from our own Prime Minister's very successful visit to Manila, which took place when he had gone for the ASEAN-related summits last year in November. our Prime Minister conveyed his deep appreciation to President Duterte. You would be aware that there is a Mayan volcano that has erupted, which is naturally a cause of concern. And in fact, because of that, President Duterte had to delay his flight because he needed to attend to issues relating to ensuring safety and whatever arrangements are to be made back home. So he delayed his flight, but however, he has come accompanied by a very high-level delegation with several cabinet ministers, once again underlining the importance that he personally attached to this visit and his presence as part of this summit and as guest of honor for our Republic Day. And that gesture was deeply appreciated by our Prime Minister, and he conveyed his sincerest thanks to him for that. There was discussion about the menace of terrorism that we are afflicted with, both Philippines and India and the region, in fact, the world at large. And there was, I think, a huge an understanding that there was a need to work together for greater intelligence sharing, for capacity building on how to counter terrorism. And in that context, President Duterte once again conveyed his deepest appreciation to our Prime Minister for the assistance of $500,000 that was provided by India to resettle victims of the Marawi siege. So therefore, in that context, I think there was a very important discussion on countering terrorism, and especially on how to deal with urban terrorism. And in that context, President Duterte did mention their own experience of countering the menace of drug trafficking, which again is a very important subject as it afflicts the youth of our two countries and must be combated collectively. There were shared concerns about proliferation of weapons of mass destruction and about the networks, the linkages, the international networks and linkages involved in such proliferation activities. President Duterte expressed an interest and his desire for greater cooperation with India in the pharmaceutical sector, and it was agreed that a joint working group meeting could be set up in March to finalize these details. There was also a desire for enhancing cooperation in the defense sector, including in shipbuilding and offshore patrol vessels, an area where India has experience and strength. President Duterte conveyed his appreciation for the role of the Indian community that they have played, the very positive role that they play in their presence in various fields, including economic and the services sector. In fact, he told our Prime Minister that he had grown up with Indians and he was very familiar with Indian culture and their commitment to hard work. And so there was a personal resonance that he had as well. Prime Minister himself, in turn, recalled to him that there were several of the students studying in Philippines who are in fact from our Prime Minister's state of Gujarat. And they had also talked about the dynamism of President Duterte in his home state when he was mayor before becoming the president of Philippines. In addition to pharmaceutical sector, yet another area where our Prime Minister and President Duterte had discussions was on the importance of the participation of the Indian private sector in infrastructure development. And in fact, they are in the process of, there is an Indian company, the GMR, that has won, I think, a major contract on building an airport. 2 airports in Philippines, and so that was yet another area where appreciation of the performance of Indian private sector industries and infrastructure was discussed. Moving on to the next bilateral that Prime Minister had early this morning, and that was with the Prime Minister of Thailand, General Prayut Chan-o-cha. What is significant in the context of the ASEAN summit is the fact that from July onwards, Thailand will be the country coordinator. Singapore is the chair of ASEAN this year, and Thailand will be the country coordinator for India from July onwards. And so the country coordinator within the ASEAN country is an important country for the interface between ASEAN and India. And so to that extent, our Prime Minister conveyed his appreciation and said he looked forward to working with Thailand. And in that context, let me just go back to the Vietnam, because currently Vietnam is a country coordinator. And again, Vietnam has played a very important role in enhancing India's participation in India-ASEAN relations. So our Prime Minister talked about his Act East policy and the importance that he attached to ASEAN, both individual countries as well as the region. And in that context, Thai Prime Minister spoke about their own Act West policy. So we have the Act East policy and they have an Act West policy, and how there is a convergence of interest of the two policies of the two separate governments coming together. And therefore, they did talk about enhancing connectivity in this context. Apart from Thailand being part of ASEAN, we work very closely with Thailand as part of a sub-regional grouping of the Mekong-Ganga cooperation. So Mekong-Ganga has Thailand in it. And yet another grouping, and that is BIMSTEC. So along with India, Thailand is also a founder member of BIMSTEC. So those are other two regional groupings where there is a lot that we can work together. Bilaterally, they did discuss about greater cooperation in defense and maritime security, about enhancing regular ship visits and exercises, about the prospects of cooperation in coastal surveillance radar systems and offshore patrol vessels. There was, of course, a proposal for greater cooperation in maritime natural resources and tourism. You know that Thailand is a very important destination for tourism. India, again, has a huge potential for enhancing tourism. India has already, I think the latest figures about tourism sector have been very positive. So that is yet another area where there's scope for cooperation in building package tourism between our two countries. Moving on to Singapore, that was the fifth bilateral that our Prime Minister had again this morning. Again, acknowledgement of the high level of political understanding and political exchanges that have taken place and continue to take place between our two countries. You would be aware that our Prime Minister has been invited as the chief guest for the Shangri-La Dialogue, which is the flagship event that takes place in Singapore. And this time, Prime Minister has accepted that invitation, and he'll be visiting in June. In the context of Singapore and the ASEAN, I mentioned earlier that Singapore is the chair of ASEAN, so our Prime Minister conveyed his appreciation for Singapore's very positive role in India's participation in India-ASEAN relations, and about our optimism that we were certain Singapore would guide the ASEAN process under the chairmanship of ASEAN to enhance India-ASEAN relations. Earlier this month, Singapore had hosted the Prabasi Bharati Divas. It was organized by the Ministry of External Affairs. Our External Affairs Minister had hosted that event. It had overwhelming support and participation of the Indian diaspora from all the 10 ASEAN countries. It was entitled the India-ASEAN Prabasi Bharati Divas. And so Singapore Prime Minister acknowledged that importance. They did talk about fintech and RuPay. Two proposals, the India's RuPay and Singapore's fintech, and how these could decrease costs for transactions and promote cashless economy, something that Singapore is also working towards. They did also hold discussions on early conclusion of the second round of SICA, and about enhancing cooperation in civil aviation sector, where our Prime Minister invited Singapore Airlines to also start operations to other cities, especially Guwahati, which is in the northeast being such an important connect to the ASEAN region. And you're aware that there is Singapore's participation in building Amravati and some other cities as smart cities, and so there is already an existing good cooperation. Yet another area that was discussed was IT and innovation. And today there was an op-ed which has been published in an Indian newspaper by the Prime Minister of Singapore in his capacity as chair of ASEAN, which is extremely forward-looking and visionary and talks about enhancing India-ASEAN relations. Finally, the last bilateral meeting that our Prime Minister had was with the Sultan of Brunei. They expressed satisfaction at the current state of relations. His Majesty, the Sultan, invited our Prime Minister to visit Brunei, and our Prime Minister accepted that invitation. Enhancing cooperation in health sector, IT, around 11,000 Indians contribute to education and health, and the need to enhance cooperation in pharmaceuticals. That was yet another one, which was very important. Oil and gas, Brunei is rich in that, and they conveyed their desire for greater participation of India in this sector. Also agreed for greater exchange in security and defense cooperation, and cultural and sports cooperation, including polo. So these are broad frameworks of the bilaterals. I'll stop here, take some questions. I need to rush, so I won't be in a position to take more. But maybe tomorrow Ravish can have,
another round.
Another round. Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am. We are really running short of time. As you know, that plenary has started. So maybe a few questions. Vinita?
Ma'am, can you please brief us on the retreat that happened today afternoon on the maritime security and the related issues?
So, typically in any summit, of course, there's always a plenary, which also has an open session and a closed session. And usually we brief you at the end of the closed session on what happened. That's yet to take place, so we'll let you know what happened. And we'll let you know either later tonight or tomorrow. As far as the retreat is concerned, you know the thumb rule of a retreat is a retreat. And really there's not much that one can really disclose. It was on maritime cooperation. The leaders did agree to establish a mechanism for greater cooperation in the maritime domain sector. They did discuss the issues of greater maritime cooperation in addressing both traditional and non-traditional challenges that all of us face collectively, since we are all seafaring nations. In fact, they did recall the importance of India's maritime, traditional, historical linkages, the trade routes through which our religion, our trade has continued through these waters. Of course, I can only share one nugget of the discussions. It is from our Prime Minister that he talked about Nari Shakti, and you would know that there is a 6-member Indian Women's Navy team that is currently circumnavigating the southern hemisphere. And